We clearly can't keep going the way we are. Mr. President, I yield the floor. Mr. President, I suggest the absence of a quorum.
The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.
Mr. President.
The senator from South Carolina.
I'd ask unanimous consent to be able to engage the senator from New Hampshire.
Senator, the Senate is in a quorum call.
Oh, I ask unanimous consent to dispense with.
Without objection, the quorum call be suspended.
Yes, Mr. President, about maybe 20 minutes, if you could let us know. When 20 minutes is up, I'd like to discuss the military retiree provision of the budget with Senator Ayotte from New Hampshire when she gets here.
Without objection.
Okay, thank you. One, the president is from Virginia and understands military men and women very well. It's a very patriotic, big state when it comes to military footprint, and I'm confident that he and I and others will be able to fix a problem that occurred in the budget agreement. Let me say about the agreement itself, I do appreciate the fact that we're able to find a bipartisan way forward to relieve sequestration from the military and non-military for a couple of years. But that's just a drop in the bucket of what we have to do to repair the military. GDP spending on the military is moving toward an all-time low over a 10-year period with sequestration. The historical average has been well over 4%, and we're going to hit below 3% if we continue sequestration. So that's an issue for another day. The budget agreement call for relieving sequestration and the pay-fors. Quite frankly, they were not big. They didn't change the course of the country. They're not what the senator from Virginia and I would have hoped for. We'd like to do entitlement reform. I would like to do tax code simplification. I'm willing to eliminate deductions in the tax code and take some of the money to pay down debt, even though some folks on my side say you got to put it all on tax reductions. And I think the senator from Virginia would be willing to engage in some common sense entitlement reform to keep us from becoming Greece. Well, you know, this was the best deal we could get. It didn't do the big deal, but it did provide some budget relief for a 2-year period. And it was about, $60-something billion. I can't remember the number. The bottom line is one of the ways that you paid for relieving pressure on the defense budget and non-defense spending was there was a provision affecting military retirees that nobody will own that got into the budget agreement. I'm on the budget committee. I wasn't consulted about the agreement. I read about it in the paper. And there's a fine line between having a bunch of people involved that kind of keep things from never developing to produce a product to a handful of people doing something in a small room not vetted. And so the bottom line is $6.3 billion of the pay-fors came from adjusting military retirement cost of living allowances for those who have served our military for 20 years and therefore eligible for retirement. What they did is they took the COLA, reduced it by 1% for every military retiree until they reach the age of 62. Now, the president, to his credit, has called for adjusting CPI, the way COLAs are calculated, for everybody, for civilians, military, Social Security, to make it more consistent with sustainable inflationary increases. This didn't adjust the COLA. It left the formula as it is. It just reduced the military retirees' COLA by 1% until the military retiree reaches 62, and that's the only group in the country that had that happen. And that was $6.3 billion taken away from men and women who have served for 20 years, and no one else had the pleasure of that experience. Civilian employees, new hires had to contribute additional funds to the federal retirement system to help pay for the deal. but it only affected new retirees. The people who are in the system were grandfathered. The only group that we found fit as Congress to single out for retroactive application was the retiree community. All I can say is that military pay, retirement, pension pay, health care benefits are going to be subject to being reviewed, and they will be subject to reform because a larger portion of our budget and DOD is personnel cost. The Congress, in their wisdom, set up a commission to look at this issue, and they're supposed to report back in 2014, now maybe as late as 2015, about how to reform military pay and benefits as part of an overall restructuring of the Pentagon. One thing that the Congress put into the commission's charter was that you have to grandfather people who are currently in the system. What we did in the budget agreement is that we singled out military retirees for a 1% reduction in their COLA, and nobody was grandfathered. $6.3 billion coming out of the pockets of those who have served, and to an E7 who retires at 40 and has his COLA reduced or her COLA reduced to 62, it's between $71,984 to $80,000, depending on who you talk to, loss in benefits. And an E7 receives in retirement pay after 20 years of faithful service about $25,000 a year. Not exactly becoming independently wealthy. But we have one of the leading voices on this issue, Senator Ayotte from New Hampshire, who took this challenge up, came up with some solutions early on, has been a great voice about how unfair this is. So I would like to yield to her.
Thank you. I want to thank my colleague from South Carolina. And I want to I come to the floor because, you know, I picked up an editorial this morning from the Washington Post that calls the cuts to the cost of living adjustments to military retirees minuscule, demeans this criticism as calls the cut teensy-weensy. I don't understand why anyone would want to support something that singles out. In other words, under this budget agreement, the group that got the cuts currently to their current benefits was those who have sacrificed the most for our country. And to call this minuscule or teensy-weensy, I don't think it's so minuscule as the senator from South Carolina said to an E7 who makes about $25,000 a year in retirement and will lose close to $72,000 from the time that he or she retires at 40 until they can until 62. But that's about 3 years of your retirement. That's not minuscule in a working family. So this is not a minor situation, not minuscule to one of our veterans, those wounded warriors who have given the most, who have unfortunately suffered so much.
This applies to disabled retirees too, right? It
does. It applies to those when we all visit Walter Reed, and we've all met our wounded warriors. They're heroes. They've sacrificed more than we can ever ask anyone to sacrifice for our nation. Some of them don't have arms, legs, and they receive a medical retirement because of their service and their disability, the service that they have rendered for our country so bravely, and they get cut under this too. I don't think any cut to them is teensy-weensy or minuscule. And I don't understand, perhaps the editorial board writers in Washington, only in Washington would this be minimized in terms of how people are viewed as minuscule or teensy-weensy in light of the service that they've given to our country. So I thought this description of it was wrong and offensive and really demoralizing in terms of the message it sends to our men and women in uniform. I think the encouraging part of where we are right now is that so many in this body have come forward and said we need to fix this and recognize that this does have an unfair impact on our military retirees and, of course, those who have received a medical retirement. And so I just want to say that the people who are, whether I disagreed with them voting for the agreement, but regardless of where you were on the agreement, I think it's time for us to come together on a bipartisan basis and do the right thing here and fix this on behalf of our men and women in uniform, especially our wounded warriors. And so I just want to say that obviously this body realizes that this is not minuscule and that this is not teensy-weensy in terms of the impact on our heroes and those who have sacrificed so much for our country. And I'm very encouraged to see so many of my colleagues over the last couple days to come forward with different ideas about how we can fix this and do the right thing on behalf of our men and women in uniform. I myself have introduced a piece of legislation that would come up with billions of dollars for a pay-for to fix this. I know others have different ideas, but I know this. We can put politics aside on this. We can fix this for our men and women in uniform. And as we go home for the holidays, I think when we come back in January, this should be a #1 priority for us in this body, is to do the right thing for our military retirees, for those who are our wounded warriors. And the number of people I've seen come out in the last few days gives me encouragement, Mr. President, that we will be able to do this and do it quickly on their behalf to right this wrong, and to let them know that as they are, some of them are 19 years in and maybe have done multiple tours in Afghanistan and thinking of getting out, that we understand their sacrifice. We should not have singled them out, that we will get this right, and that we understand that of all the people who should not have been singled out in this agreement are those who take the bullets for us and whose families have had to go through multiple deployments. You know, when I think about the fact when you've done a 20-year military career and you've had multiple deployments, your spouse can't have the same kind of career than if you were able to live in one place. They sacrifice so much because they're traveling around the world, and the retirement that they receive obviously recognizes that. So, Mr. President, as we leave in this body, I hope we get this right. We take this up. We honor the service of our men and women in uniform and do the right thing here. I'll turn it back to the Senator from South Carolina.
Senator from South Carolina.
Thank you. I think the Senator from Illinois has a request.
Senator from Illinois.
Mr. President, first I want to thank my colleagues from New Hampshire and South Carolina for allowing me to intervene between their colloquy and remarks to make this request, which we have discussed with the other side. Mr. President, there is at least an opportunity or a tradition at the end of a calendar year that we take the nominations pending in the United States Senate, both in committee and on the calendar, and literally return them to the White House. That means that at the beginning of the next year, we start over. It may mean a hearing, it may mean postponement, but we lose all that we've achieved up to this point. We absolutely have to start over. I would like to argue at this point that we seriously consider changing that tradition, and I'll make unanimous consent to change it. There are some 238 total nominees that are at issue here. 83 are on the executive calendar and 155 are pending in committee. Nominations sent by the White House to Capitol Hill, which have either been not lost in committee, but held in committee, are sent to the calendar. Of the group that I've just mentioned, the 238, 47 are judicial nominations, 36 are ambassadors, and I've read through the list of countries here. They range from some of the smallest on earth to larger countries as well, and 86 nominees to cabinet-level agencies. So it is a wide spectrum of appointments that have been sent for Senate consideration to Capitol Hill. Now, we are embroiled in an internal debate about the rules of the Senate, the filibuster, and nominations. It is one that has not been resolved to the satisfaction of both sides of the aisle, but we have labored through it over the last several weeks and will when we return. What I'm going to do is make a unanimous consent here that those nominations, all of them, the military nominations as well as others be held here on the calendar and in committee and not be returned to the White House, requiring that we repeat everything that we've done in this previous year. We don't get high marks at the end of this year for our legislative performance, and to throw aside all of the effort that's been put into these nominees and require the White House to start over is just literally a waste of time and unfortunate for these nominees, many of whom have been waiting for a long, long period of time for consideration and a vote by the United States Senate. So this is a chance with this unanimous consent request to get the next year off to a good start, where we can take what's been done with nominees, use it, take those that are on the calendar, move forward. They'll still be subject to an up or down vote. The Senate has to work its will, and that will not be compromised at all by the unanimous consent request that I'm making, but I'm hoping that I can get this request through so that when we return January 6th, we're going to have an opportunity to move with a little more dispatch and more productivity in the Senate. As in executive session, I ask unanimous consent that all the nominations received by the Senate during the 113th Congress first session remain in status quo, notwithstanding the provisions of Rule 31, paragraph 6 of the Standing Rules of the Senate.
Is there objection?
Yes, reserving the right to object to my good friend from Illinois. All I can say is that the normal way the Senate has operated for a couple hundred years has been destroyed this year. And to ask that normalcy come about now is just beyond the pale. But we are where we are. So I object, understanding that but I do urge the Senate to act to confirm the many military nominations that are pending for the Army, Navy, Air Force, and Coast Guard. So my objection with that understanding.
The objection is heard.
Mr. President.
Assistant Majority Leader.
Mr. President, I understand that we're at a point of great emotions and feelings, stress in the Senate over the change in the rules on the use of the filibuster in the Senate. Unfortunately, it appears that we're going to stay in that state for at least a short period of time, and I'm not holding my colleague from South Carolina accountable for that. I believe what he has done is reflected the feelings on that side of the aisle, not just his personal feelings. But I do believe he's made a valuable suggestion, which I'll now follow up on. I ask unanimous consent the Senate proceed to executive session to consider the following nominations. Calendar numbers 460 through and including 477, and all nominations on the Secretary's desk in the Air Force, Army, and Navy. That the nominations be confirmed en bloc, the motions to reconsider be considered made and laid upon the table with no intervening action or debate, that no further motions be in order to any of the nominations, that any related statements be printed in the record, that the President be immediately notified of the Senate's action.
Is there objection? Without objection, so ordered.
Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent the Commerce Committee be discharged from further consideration of PN 877 and 878, that the nominations be confirmed, the motion to reconsider be considered made and laid upon the table with no intervening action or debate, that no further motions be in order to the nomination, that any related statements be printed in the record, that the President be immediately notified of the Senate's actions, and the Senate then resume legislative session.
Is there objection?
No.
Without objection, so ordered.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. President. Now let's get back to what I was discussing. The bottom line is that Senator Ayotte mentioned this Washington Post editorial. Washington Post is, in my view, a very good newspaper. I like the editorial board, and they've been right on Syria and a lot of other issues, and we sometimes disagree, that's for sure. But this one editorial has gotten my attention to the point that I have to respond and, quite frankly, ask my friends at the Washington Post to reevaluate your position and think a little bit about what you're saying in your editorial when it comes to military retirees. As she said, the editorial says this is a teensy-weensy small cut. I said that we were screwing the military retirement community, and maybe a better way of saying it was we're disrespecting the military retiree community. Because when I said you were screwing the military retirees, that was sort of like the financial package. They're having to give up retirement benefits through COLA reductions that not one other person in the entire country has to go through. And it's not teensy-weensy. When it's 1% calculated over from 40 to 62, it is $71,000 to $80,000. If you're an officer, $100,000. Again, you get about $25,000 in retirement when you're an E7. Somewhere in the 30s if you're a 05. But to get that, you have to serve your country for 20 years, uprooting your family. Probably the average number of moves has got to be 5 or 6. If you've been on active duty since 9/11, God knows how many times you've been to Iraq and Afghanistan and other places. And here's the deal. Your children are not subject to being drafted. Why? Because we abolished the draft and we put in place an all-volunteer force. And part of the deal was that we would take care of the military member and their family in an appropriate way if they would bear that burden for the rest of us. Now, are these people really living large off the rest of us? Should we be offended at this great deal we're giving these people who retire at 40 or 45 or 38? You know, my God, aren't they just sort of taking the rest of us for a ride attitude? Really offends the hell out of me. To get that $25,000 in retirement for the rest of your life, and I hope you live to be 80 or you just named the number, you had to work for it. You had to risk your life for it. You had to ask of your children something that most people don't have to ask, and that's just move and leave your friends every couple of years. You had to do things for the rest of us that apparently we don't appreciate anymore at the Washington Post. Now, I don't know what the editorial board's makeup is. They're all patriotic, I'm sure, good people, and if they got veterans down there, boy, you let your fellow veteran down by approaching this issue in such a harsh, insensitive way. Their response was, no, the military retiree is not getting screwed. This is just a small step to something larger. What they're trying to do, which offends me, is one, they don't know what they're talking about, which is unusual for the Washington Post. Don't confuse my disgust with this singling out military retirees in a retroactive fashion to pay for a budget deal that doesn't do a whole lot to change the course of the country with my desire and willingness to reform military pay and pension benefits in the future through a logical process. You know, that offends me. And that's pretty clever. So can you be for reform and be disgusted at the same time? Yeah. And here's the good news. Very few U.S. senators are taking the Washington Post tactic that these people deserve more cuts, not less, singled out. I think the Washington Post is on an island of its own. At least I hope so. People have voted yes. Senator McCain, God knows he's earned his retirement. Senator Chambliss, Senator Isaacson have come up with a way to fix this. And all three of them will say, I will embrace military retirement, pay and benefit reform in the future. I'm just not going to single out the military retiree and reduce their COLA when no one else gets that reduction, retroactively violating our own commission charter. So, Senator Shaheen on the other side wants to fix it. Senator Murray wants to fix it. I'm really pleased that a lot of people have said, now that I understand how this works, we need to fix it. And I haven't even mentioned the fact it does apply to disabled retirees. If you've had your legs blown off in Afghanistan, it might be pretty hard to get another job. Your COLA is reduced too. Now, what do you say to those people? Thank you? Itsy bitsy teeny weeny? Really? But they didn't mention in the editorial that it applies to the disabled retiree. Is $600 million of the $6 billion comes from that community. And here's my point. It's not just so much that we're insensitive. It just shows me how far we've fallen as a nation and how comfortable we are for other people to do the fighting. And we see these folks almost as the hired help, even though we just effusively praise them. And we should. We welcome them home when they come back. We cheer when they go away. We trip over ourselves as politicians to show our love and affection. The average person at the airport says, thank you for your service. We're well-meaning people. But to believe that somehow they're being fairly treated in this budget deal, and we're just not doing enough from the Washington Point's perspective, I think loses sight of what they have done for the rest of us. Let's say you never reformed a penny of military retirement in the future, and we just left it as it is. About $1.734 million is the package over the lifetime from the 20-year retirement point to death, which the average could be 40 years. We need to look at that. But let's say that we didn't change a penny. Over a 40-year period at $25,000 a year, do you really begrudge these people this package? After 20 years of service, they're now in their 40s, late 30s. The average is probably in the mid-40s. They've got to start over again. Go do that. Not so easy. And somehow we're suggesting that we're being too generous. What would you? Would you send your kid? If I gave you $1.74 million over the next 40 years, is that worth it for you to have your kid sent over to Afghanistan or Iraq if they didn't want to go? That's what this is about. So to my friends at the Washington Post, I just don't know what happened here. I just don't know how you could justify and defend this provision in the budget agreement that nobody wants to claim credit for. Again, I will reform military pay, pension, and retirement through the commission process prospectively, but I will not sit on the sidelines and watch these people, yes, get screwed financially, but more than that, be disrespected. To my House and Senate colleagues, Republican and Democrats, we created this problem together. We will have to fix it together. And to the military retiree community, the disabled retiree, I am confident that Republicans and Democrats will right this wrong. Now, having said that, there will come a day when we sit down and look long and hard about the sustainable nature of personnel cost, TRICARE reform, pay and pension reform, but we're going to do it understanding that you have a special place in our heart. But when it comes to balancing the budget and writing the Department of Defense long-term financial obligations, that we will look at this in a professional manner, and we'll do it in the way least intrusive, and we'll give people notice. We won't change the deal. Can you imagine what it's like to have fought since 9/11? You're getting ready to retire in 2016 after 20 years of faithful service, or maybe longer. You're from your last deployment in Afghanistan. You've been to Iraq a couple of times, Afghanistan a couple of times, had a couple of buddies die. You've missed countless birthdays and Christmases, and every time a strange car pulls up in the driveway, your spouse loses their breath. And you read that this is what the Congress is doing to you, changing the deal. You did your part of the deal, but all of a sudden, we decide to change the deal because we got to find some money around this place to pay for a budget deal that doesn't do a whole lot for the long-term indebtedness of the country. And when we looked to find money, we saw you as a source of money, not as the patriot, not as the frontline defender of freedom, not as the volunteer who took the burden off our backs and gave our families a pass. Shame on us all. But the way you fix it is you fix it. To my friends at the Washington Post, Bowles Simpson never said, as part of their efforts to balance the budget, which I embrace their process, that we would eliminate military retiree COLAs as a recommendation. They set a target goal of saving $70 billion over 10 years from Federal Workforce Entitlement Task Force to be set up to look at civilians and military that work for the federal government, and they created a task force with a target goal of achieving $70 billion as a contribution toward reforming entitlements on that side of the ledger. They gave examples of what the task force might look at. Use the highest 5 years of earnings to calculate civil service pension benefits for new retirees rather than the highest 3 years. That could save $5 billion. Defer cost of living adjustment, like we're talking about here. That could save $5 billion. Adjust the ratio of employer-employee contributions to federal employee pension plans to equalize contributions, $4 billion. These are examples of things to look at, not Bowles-Simpson recommendations. The recommendation of Bowles-Simpson was to find $70 billion from military and civilian retirement programs over 10 years through a task force. What did the Congress do? We set up a commission, rather than a task force, to do exactly what Bowles-Simpson said to do, and to our wisdom, we told the commission, when it comes to the military, grandfather those who are currently in the system. That made sense to me. But under the budget agreement, we violated our own instructions to the commission by getting $6.3 billion from the military retirement community retroactively from everybody in the system up to age 62, and only them. The civilian workforce had to make a contribution only for new hires. If that is okay with the Washington Post, then I would suggest you have lost your way down there. And I hope I never get so smart that taking 72,000, 80,000, 100,000, whatever the number is, the bottom line, the minimum is 72,000 out of the E7 cost of living adjustment, 3 years of their retirement. I hope I never get so smart about the budget that I find that to be itsy-bitsy, teeny-weeny. I hope I never get so callous that I could sit on the sidelines and allow the military retirement community to be singled out, unlike anybody else in the nation, to find $6.3 billion when we were looking for money. The bottom line is we'll find $6.3 billion. We're going to find it in a more acceptable way. And there'll come a day when we reform benefits, but we're going to do it consistent with the charter that the Congress has created. To our military community, you need to fight. You need to show up during the holiday break, and you need to remind all of us, just not members of Congress, you need to toot your horn a little bit because it's so darn hard for you to do. You should humbly ask the United States House and Senate to reconsider this. You should humbly ask that the pay you received has been earned, and to change the deal in midstream is wrong. And you should remind us that I have lived up to my end of the bargain. I'm only asking that you live up to your end of the bargain. We need your voice. So to the senator from Virginia who is presiding over the Senate, I know you will be part of this solution. There is a sweeping movement here in the Senate to try to find a way to right what I think is an injustice. Reform will come one day, but it's sure as hell not going to come this way. I yield the floor. Merry Christmas.
The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.
Mr. President,
Senator from Hawaii.
I ask unanimous consent to vacate the quorum call.
Without objection, the quorum call be suspended.
Thank you, Mr. President. Last night, the Senate passed the Native American Memorial Amendments Act of 2013. The bill now heads to the President for his signature. I introduced the Native American Memorial Amendments Act in May, and I've worked with Representative Mullen since he introduced an identical bill in the House in June. This bill is needed to facilitate construction of a long-awaited Native American Veterans Memorial on the National Mall. This memorial has languished for almost 20 years since the passage of the original Native American Veterans Memorial Establishments Act. This legislation builds off of the great work of Senator McCain, who introduced the initial bill to authorize a Native Veterans Memorial, and Senator Inouye, who was the Indian Affairs Committee chairman who worked to enact the law in 1994. My bill also continues Senator Akaka's great effort to fulfill the promise of this memorial. Native Americans, including Native Hawaiians, Alaska Natives, and American Indians, serve and have always served at a higher rate in the armed forces than any other group of Americans per capita. In every conflict since the Revolutionary War, Native Americans have answered the call to serve and defend our country. I introduced my bill so that our nation can recognize Native American service and patriotism with a fitting memorial. A memorial to Native veterans will make sure future generations learn about the sacrifices Native Americans have made in service to our nation. And it will commemorate their exceptional commitment to the principles of freedom and democracy. Last month, Congress awarded its highest honor, the Congressional Gold Medal, to the American Indians we know as Code Talkers. These brave men played a critical and for too long unacknowledged role in both world wars. The celebration of our legendary Code Talkers in Emancipation Hall at the United States Capitol was a historic and proud moment. But it's regrettable that most of the 216 honored did not live to see their heroic contributions acknowledged. Congress was decades late in recognizing Native American Code Talkers' work when we needed them most. We can't make that mistake again. I believe now is the perfect time to move forward on a lasting tribute to all Native veterans, including the extraordinary contributions of Native Hawaiians. Mr. President, my home state of Hawaii is second to none when it comes to patriotism, public service, and personal sacrifice. The heroic deeds of Anthony T. Kaho'ohanohano from Wailuku, Maui, prove just how true this is. He joined the Army to fight in combat in the Korean War. He was assigned to Company H, 17th Infantry Regiment, 7th Infantry Division, Private First Class Kaho'ohanohano displayed extraordinary heroism near Chopra-ri, Korea on September 1st, 1951. Due to the enemy's overwhelming numbers, troops were forced to execute a limited withdrawal. As the men fell back, Kaho'ohanohano ordered his squad to take up more defensible positions. He provided cover fire for them. Although painfully wounded in the shoulder during the initial enemy assault, he gathered a supply of grenades and ammunition and returned to his original position to face the enemy alone. Kaho'ohanohano delivered deadly accurate fire onto the advancing enemy. After going through all his ammunition, he engaged the enemy in hand-to-hand combat until he paid the ultimate price, fighting to protect his fellow soldiers. President Obama awarded U.S. Army Private First Class Kaho'ohanohano the Presidential Medal of Honor, our nation's highest military honor, posthumously. Private First Class Kaho'ohanohano, the thousands of Native Hawaiians and Native Americans who have served our country with such honor, deserve a memorial on the National Mall. My Native American Memorial Amendments Act that passed last night will allow for a privately funded memorial to be located on grounds under the jurisdiction of the National Museum of the American Indian. The museum will have the much-needed flexibility to raise funds and take on a more active role in planning and construction. The Native American Memorial Amendments Act of 2013 was endorsed by the National Congress of the American Indian, Alaska Federation of Natives, and the Council for Native Hawaiian Advancements, the largest 3 Native American membership organizations in the country. The National Museum of the American Indian and the National Park Service are in agreement as well. I want to thank the strong support of the bipartisan co-sponsors of this bill, Senators Barrasso, Begich, Heitkamp, Hirono, Inhofe, Murkowski, Tester, Thune, and Wyden. I also want to thank especially Chairwoman Maria Cantwell for her work to ensure the passage of this bill. It is long past time for our nation to honor the uncommon contributions of Native Hawaiians, Native Alaskans, and American Indians, and other Native veterans. These brave men and women have served during war and peace to preserve our freedoms in remarkably high numbers. The valor of our Native American veterans, their dedication to duty, and remarkable record of military service must forever be remembered. This memorial will do just that. Thank you, Mr. President. I yield the floor and suggest the absence of a quorum.
The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.
Quorum call on the Senate floor today, senators having completed all of its work for the year. Earlier today, senators wrapped up business with a series of votes on several of President Obama's nominees, eventually confirming 3 of them. Among them was John Koskinen to take over at the helm as IRS Commissioner. The chamber also voted to advance Janet Yellen's nomination to become the next Federal Reserve Board chair. Ms. Yellen would become the first woman to lead the agency, replacing Ben Bernanke. His term runs out at the end of January. The Senate comes back from their Christmas recess to vote on Ms. Yellen's nomination on Monday, January 6th. While the Senate stays in this quorum call, we'll bring you somewhat of an event from earlier today, looking at U.S.-Saudi relations and how it's been impacted by the nuclear deal with Iran and Syria's civil war. This event was hosted by the Hudson Institute here in Washington.
About an hour and a half here. We're going to speak for about 45 minutes to an hour, then we'll open it up at the end for questions and answers. So thank you again for coming to Hudson, and thank you to our C-SPAN audience, and thank you for this wonderful panel with Elliott Abrams and Brian Katulis. Elliott Abrams was Deputy National Security Advisor for Global Democracy Strategy during the George W. Bush administration. He is currently a Senior Fellow for Middle Eastern Studies at the Council on Foreign Relations and the author, most recently, of Tested by Zion, the Bush Administration and the Israeli-Palestinian Conflict. Brian Katulis is a Senior Fellow at the Center for American Progress, where he focuses on the Middle East and North Africa. He is co-author of The Prosperity Agenda, What the World Wants from America and What We Need in Return. There are also a couple of articles by Brian Katulis over there on the site. I think they're still available, and about Brian's recent work on Saudi Arabia, which he'll fill us in a bit. In the meantime, I wanted Mr. Abrams to make a few comments at first, and then Brian will, and then we'll have a discussion. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you all for being here today. I wanted to start by saying that some of the discussion of U.S.-Saudi relations, I think, is overdone. The sense of a hopeless crisis that will result in incurable differences. This is an old relationship, roughly 75 years old. Aramco was founded in 1944, and there have been a lot of ups and downs. I mean, whatever the challenge is today, think of 1973, the Arab oil embargo, which you could, in a certain sense, call an act of war by the Saudis against the United States, or think of 2001. So the relationship has been through crises and survived them. And another positive point, the relationship is more supple, thicker today than in many years in the past. That is, there have been times, I think, when the relationship was king-president. This is about it. You now have an institutionalized relationship. There is a mill-mill relationship. There's a CIA-Saudi intel relationship. There's a DHS-Saudi Interior Ministry relationship, FBI. There's a Treasury Ministry of Finance relationship. It doesn't just depend on one or two individuals. Obviously, the relationship is based to a very large degree on oil, but even there, I think one should expand that a little. There was an alliance during the Cold War against the Soviet Union. There was an alliance after 1979 against Iran. There was also an American appreciation over the last decades of what I would call professional, reliable Saudi handling of oil as the world's swing oil supplier, and of money by the Saudi Treasury and investment authorities. It has been an alliance of two very, very different societies. That can be hidden. I mean, if you're an American official, you know, dealing with Foreign Minister Saud, who's a graduate of Princeton, you don't have the sense that you're dealing with someone who cannot navigate your culture. But still, these are two very, very different societies when it comes to matters like religious freedom, political freedom, treatment of women. I think that's going to be a growing problem. It wasn't a big problem for many decades. We had a lot of allies that were very different societies and that were, in some cases, pretty unattractive dictatorships, starting with Joseph Stalin in World War II. And we went through a long period in the Cold War when the internal situation in a friendly country didn't matter to us. It matters more and more now as human rights values get, I hate this word, but globalized, and as America pays over time generally more attention to those questions. We no longer just say, oh, well, that's a different culture. And I think that's going to be more important because what has been missing for over the decades has been the Saudi end of that. That is, we heard from the royal family. We didn't hear from the people of Saudi Arabia. There was no visible civil society in Saudi Arabia. There is now, partly because of technology. I mean, now there's Twitter, now there are blog posts. Now the Saudi people appear just a little bit as actors. That's got to increase, it seems to me. And that will increase over years when Saudi oil is less important to us because of all these trends toward North American energy independence. One would have to assume that Saudi influence in Washington will decline rather than growing. There's obviously a crisis of confidence here today over Syria, over Egypt, and particularly over Iran. And I think that the Saudis have relied on us since 1979 to be in a confrontation with Iran, and we have been. And they're very worried, I think, that now the United States may decide not to be in a confrontation with Iran. And of course, our views of Iran are fundamentally different from theirs. Their problem is this is a powerful Persian Shia country. Our problem's with the Islamic Republic. And if it weren't the Islamic Republic, if it were a democratic Iran, our problems would largely disappear, but it's not at all clear the Saudis' problems would disappear. We can come back to that. I would just add one other thing. The crisis that we're having in relations now, the difficulties in relations, the lack of good communication, which I think can partly be blamed on the administration, but of course several of the top people in Saudi Arabia are very old and sick. And having the kind of relationship we had, let's say, 10 years ago, 15 years ago, would be far more difficult today. Saudi Arabia may, in the next few years, enter a succession crisis. The king is over 90 and not in good health. The crown prince is apparently in worse health. You look at the statistics, we may get a succession crisis during the Obama administration. Never, I think it's fair to say, since the establishment of this government by Ibn Saud have we not known who's next. It's not at all clear that Crown Prince Salman can take over, is well enough to take over. And you have that succession problem at a time when the Saudis are reaching the end of the brothers and are going to have to confront the question of going to the next generation.
I ask the quorum call be suspended.
Without objection.
Madam President, I ask unanimous consent the Senate proceed to the consideration of H.R. 3343, which was received from the House and is presently at the